Welcome back, everyone. For this lecture, we're going to talk about homeostasis and acid-base balance for the EMS provider. Homeostasis, in a nutshell, is the body's ability to maintain its optimal operating state. This includes things like temperature regulation and pH regulation to ensure that the body has the ability to be the most efficient in engaging in its processes. In general, there is a stimulus that moves into the body via the sensor pathway, and then the brain takes that signal and sends another signal to the control center of the body to say, okay, let's engage in some process to correct the error in homeostasis. This process occurs through what are known as feedback loops. For example, if we look at the image on the left-hand side of your screen, if the body temperature falls, that is sensed by the body, and the brain then directs the blood vessels to constrict so that the heat is conserved. Heat is then retained, and that moves the body back to the normal temperature. If the body temperature rises, the blood vessels will then dilate. Sweat glands will secrete fluid, and that fluid evaporation causes heat loss. Once the heat is lost to the environment, the body is restoring its normal body temperature and thus maintaining that homeostatic state, or maintaining homeostasis. This process is known as a negative feedback loop. The negative feedback loop is the body's ability to move it in the direction opposite of the stimulus. The stimulus being the body is cold, then the body moves to be warmer. The stimulus, if the body is hot, the actions move the body to be colder. That's the negative feedback system. There are also positive feedback systems within the body. These positive feedback loops are generally rare or not frequently occurring, and often pathophysiologic states that we'll talk about in EMS are an error in feedback that are runaway positive feedback loops. If a negative feedback loop moves the body in a direction away from the stimulus, the positive feedback loop moves the body in the direction of a stimulus. Let's look at one example on the right-hand side of your screen. Nerve impulses are transmitted from the cervix that indicate pressure at the cervix during childbirth. The brain then stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin. Oxytocin is carried to the uterus, and the uterus encourages contractions. The head then pushes against the cervix. The cervix transmits that to the brain, which causes the secretion of oxytocin, and we can see where this becomes a circular loop of moving in the direction of the stimulus. This is a positive feedback loop. Negative feedback loops move away from the stimulus. Positive feedback loops move in the direction of the stimulus. Let's take a minute and look at the role of pH within the body. pH is often established as part of that homeostasis process, and the maintenance of normal pH is crucial to ensuring biochemical reactions can occur and processes can occur within the body at its most essential state. We also look at pH in its ability to shift things like when oxygen has a preference to bind to carbon dioxide over hemoglobin. And then we'll assess pH in various disease states or pathophysiologies because the change in those molecules may affect that change in pH and thus can disrupt that homeostatic state. Start thinking of pH as a concentration of hydrogen ions. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen here, when the pH, normally measured from a scale of 1 to 14, as we become more acidic or more closer to 1 on the pH scale, we have a larger concentration of hydrogen ions within the body. When we become more alkali, we have a lower concentration of hydrogen ions within the body. The body's normal pH is between 7.35 and 7.45 when measured in the blood at the blood serum level. Some of these changes that are important to note in pH throughout the body can involve various pathologies and various considerations for us in treatment in EMS. One of those is the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And while we'll talk more about this when we get into respiratory emergencies, one thing that's important to note here: a left shift or a decrease in hydrogen ions reduces the affinity of oxygen, while a positive shift or a shift to the right, an increase in hydrogen ions or a lower pH, reduces the affinity for oxygen. And we can see here that this helps determine whether the hemoglobin will onboard oxygen or have a tendency to release oxygen into the blood system to be exchanged. This becomes important when we look at how well a patient can onload oxygen at the lungs and offload oxygens at the cell. One other key note with hydrogen ions: hydrogen and potassium are intricately related and linked to movement into and out of cells. And what this means is, as patients enter into disease states or disturbance of potassium, when we look at hyperkalemic patients, that can drive the pH to be more acidic based on that concentration of pH. This will also determine what complications we may see with patients who have high potassium concentration or patients who ingest acids, and it creates additional disease states within the body. Let's look at some disturbances of the acid-base balance. The lower the pH, again, that scale of 1 to 14, the higher the concentration of those hydrogen ions. Acids and bases can neutralize each other. So in an acidic state, introducing an alkali will help neutralize that acid and restore the homeostatic state, or the pH of 7.4. Alkalosis is a decrease in extracellular hydrogen ions, while acidosis is an increase in those extracellular hydrogen ions. Fluctuation in pH can also be due to the bicarbonate level within the body. I'm going to introduce another concept here. This chemical equation that you see on the top right-hand side of your screen is what's known as the bicarbonate buffer system. The bicarbonate buffer system is a chemical that's secreted by the kidneys that can both neutralize acids and introduce hydrogen ions to make the solution more acidic. It starts in the middle with that HTCO3 molecule, and we can see that depending on the state of the solution or the pH of the blood, it can move in either direction. In states where there are excessive hydrogen ions, it can absorb those hydrogen ions and bind them into things like CO2 and water. In states where there is less hydrogen ions, it can dissolve in such a manner that secretes hydrogen ions into the system. This is one of the mechanisms that the body uses to help maintain its pH balance or maintain its homeostasis. Fluctuations can occur within pH due to the patient's respiratory state or ingestion of chemicals that can alter the pH, or even excessive loss of GI material, which we'll all look at here in just a moment. Another way to look at the homeostatic sort of pendulum, if you will, for pH in the body is the pH, the normal pH range is 7.4, 7.35 to 7.45. And in a state where there's additional carbonic acid retained, and this would be a state where a patient is not ventilating adequately or can't ventilate adequately, the formation of additional bicarbonate ions helps shift that pH back to its normal state. Let's talk about some of the types of acid-base balances. The first one that we'll look at is a state of respiratory acidosis. One thing that you should keep in mind when we talk about states of respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, and we'll look at this again when we get into the respiratory emergencies. CO2, when it's dissolved in solution, and our blood is a solution, is essentially acidic. We can equate CO2 to being like hydrogen ions. So when we retain CO2 through hypoventilation, low ventilation, our pH drops and we become more acidic. This is the state of respiratory acidosis. We can see chronic states of respiratory acidosis in some patients, particularly those with COPD. And if you'll remember from anatomy and physiology, the pH of the blood and the cerebral spinal fluid indicate our respiratory rate and function, and our normal drivers for respiratory function is when that pH drops or we retain too much CO2. Patients who experience COPD were often referred to as hypoxic drived, meaning they always retain a significant amount of CO2. So they're in a constant state of mild respiratory acidosis, and the body adapts to that by utilizing the oxygen to drive respiratory rate and function. Let's look at respiratory alkalosis. Respiratory alkalosis is the opposite of respiratory acidosis. This occurs when too much CO2 is off-gassed. And this can be from states of hyperventilation or anxiety or provider-induced if we're ventilating too frequently. Carbon dioxide levels begin to drop, and the renal system, the kidneys, begin to start retaining hydrogen ions. This process also results in hypocalcemia. We can see some additional impacts that occur if we don't ventilate patients appropriately or patients are inadequately ventilating themselves at an appropriate rate. Metabolic acidosis is acidosis not related to the respiratory system. So in this case, the patient would be ventilating normally, but we're seeing an excess amount of hydrogen ions within the circulatory system. Some common causes are things like lactic acidosis and ketoacidosis, aspirin overdose or tricyclic acid antidepressant overdose, excessive alcohol ingestion can also be a problem. Metabolic alkalosis occurs with excessive acid loss. This can occur through emesis or losing a ton of gastric contents, drinking large amounts of water during exercise, or an excessive intake of alkaline substances. The compensatory mechanism for metabolic alkalosis and metabolic acidosis are both initially the respiratory system until the metabolic system can secrete more bicarbonate or retain more hydrogen ions to help balance that out over a longer term.